Chapter 1. The Essential Woman, Biophobia and the Study of Sex Differences. Each of us lives only one version of a human lifetime. We live it as a man or woman. What would it be like to perceive, to think, and to feel as a member of the opposite sex? A few transgendered individuals may get a glimpse across that invisible wall, but the sex chromosomes that we arrive with, whether XX or XY, are the ones we leave with. The psychological worlds of men and women have been a focal point of interest for scientists and feminists. But these two groups deal in different currencies. Scientists see an enigma and want to understand it. Feminists envision a social utopia and want to engineer it. During the latter part of the 20th century, feminist ideology infiltrated science to such an extent that it was hard to tell the difference between the objective facts of sex differences and the political ambition to erase them. But the only way to find a path to a social goal is to recognize where we currently stand. Evolutionary psychologists knew this, but they had a GHT on their hands. There were three camps that dominated the psychology of gender and that vocally opposed the application of evolutionary theory: social constructionism, cognitive learning theories, and social role theory. Since 1970, over 1 million studies of gender and sex differences have appeared in academic journals. The zeitgeist of the post-war years profoundly influenced the questions that researchers posed, the methods they used, and the recommendations they made. In the West, incomes rose, educational opportunity increased, and women began to discern their very unequal standing in the world of work, professional achievement, and public recognition. THSA forces informed a belief that society was perfectible and that we should aim to equalize the standing of women and men. Quite right too. But the political ideology that drove this laudable quest for social equality began to drive psychological theories too. The only acceptable account of sex differences was one which explicitly acknowledged the socially constructed, arbitrary, and malleable nature of sex differences. Women's studies became steeped in a politically driven rejection of essentialism, the idea that the sexes differ at a fundamental psychological level, and committed on one hand to social constructionism. There is no objective. 2. The Essential Woman, biophobia and the Study of Sex Differences. Truth, out there, only negotiable subjective representations, and on the other to extreme environmentalism, all sex differences result from factors external to the person. None of these roads took us very far toward an accurate understanding of why men and women differ. Social constructionists effectively removed gender from the human mind and instead allowed it to flat out freely in an insubstantial ether as a social construction, or an emergent property, or an interpretive repertoire. This is why it is possible to read statements such as the following, written in all seriousness: gender distinctions as dichotomous categories are perpetrated and maintained by social mechanisms and are socially constructed. Epstein, 1997. The prevailing dogma was that the distinction between men and women is a collective and tyrannical fixation. There are no real biological or psychological differences other than ones that we construct through discourse. For these writers, questions about the causes of sex differences never rear their heads because positivistic science, with its traditional obsession with causality, is disparaged as simply another rhetoric among many, and an outdated one at that. Woolgar. 1996. Humans are the sole focus of interest, and any comparison between our behavior and that of lower animals is unjustified, demeaning, and reductionist. This is because humans have language, language enables discourse, and it is through discourse that social reality, including gender, is constructed. This is especially true of educated, middle-class Western humans, judging by the disproportionate attention they receive. The study of discourse is the study of implicit or received meaning, and all meaning is subjective, so there can be no single authoritative or privileged reading of a text. Although social constructionists recognize the implications of this observation for their own analyses, they nevertheless deconstruct, often in dense literary and psychoanalytic terms, the ways in which gender is created in social talk. To give a flavor of their approach to gender differences, I quote from one of the most frequently cited writers of this genre, Hallway, 1984, pp. 227-228. Hence recurrent day-to-day practices and meanings through which they acquire their effectivity may contribute to the maintenance of gender difference reproduction without a hyphen, or to its modify cation, the production of modified meanings of gender leading to changed practices. I am interested in theorizing the practices and meanings which reproduce gendered subjectivity, what psychologists would call gender identity. Gender-differentiated meanings and thus the positions differentially available in discourse account for the content of gender difference. In this article, Hallway goes on to explain how different discourses about sexuality locate women and men in different positions relative to one another. She writes of the discourse of the stronger male sex drive, the discourse of the Madonna-whore distinction, and the permissive discourse, which the essential woman, biophobia and the study of sex differences. 3. Appeared to but did not liberate women's sexuality. Now each of these topics is of some considerable interest to evolutionary psychology, as we shall see, but in that discipline rather than locating them as discursive physicians they are taken as answerable empirical hypotheses about which evolutionary theory makes clear predictions. Men's sex drive should be stronger than women's, and it is Baumeister, Catanese, and Voss, 2001. Women should experience a social cost if they gain a reputation for promiscuity, and they do. Kashtan, 1996. Women should find casual sexual liaisons less satisfactory than men, and they do. Campbell, 2008. Townsend, Klein, and Wasserman, 1995. Nor are these findings exclusive to a single culture or language community, they exist independently of so-called constitutive discourse. For social constructionists, the key question of the origins of these discourses is strenuously avoided. But to assume the mechanical reproduction of discourse requires asking how it got to be like that in the first place. And that question is in danger of throwing theory back into answers according to the terms of biological, Oedipal or social and economic determinisms. Hallway, 1984, pp. 238-239. In short, better not to ask the question if you think you may not like the answer. But elsewhere in the social sciences some academics were indeed resorting to social determinism. Sex differences come from outside the child. Babies are not born wanting to play football or dress dolls. THSA preferences are imposed by parents and the media, and then encoded into children's cognitive frameworks, magnifying and reifying the differences between masculine and feminine behavior. Socialization explanations of sex differences were built on the foundation of the tabula rasa: infant coaxed, rewarded, and punished until it conformed to societal demands for sex-appropriate behavior. THEY took shape in the era of behaviorism and learning theory. THE account was a simple one. Parents treat boys and girls differently, reinforcing the correct behavior in each. Boys are encouraged to GHT, climb trees, and play football. Girls are forced to wear dresses, play with dolls, and share. Despite the fall from grace of radical behaviorism, nobody seriously doubts that reinforcement can shape behavior. THE question was whether it was strong enough to account for the worldwide patterns of sex difference that we see. THE, Baby X, paradigm was hailed as conclusive evidence of socialization differences, e.g., will, self, and Datton, 1976. A 6-month-old baby was wrapped in a blue or a pink blanket, identified as a boy or a girl, and then handed to a woman who was asked to look after it for a few minutes. When told it was a girl, the women more often offered a doll to the infant in preference to other toys. Surely this showed that parents treat infants differently as a function of their sex. But there was a problem. Despite many attempts to replicate the FECT, it seemed even weaker than it had appeared on FIRST site. 4. The Essential Woman, BIOPHOBIA and the Study of Sex Differences. And recall the FECT was found only for toy selection, there were no differences in social behavior toward the infant. It was certainly not strong enough to support the whole edifice of sex differences, Stern and Carricker, 1989. And even if parents give their children different toys, such a finding is trivial unless it can be shown that toys change the child's subsequent behavior. But the real crunch came when Liddon and Romney, 1991, collected 172 studies from around the world which examined the way in which parents treat their sons and daughters. Considering them all together, the evidence for differential treatment was virtually nil. Parents did not differ in the amount of interaction with the child, the warmth they showed, their tendency to encourage dependency or achievement, their restrictiveness, their use of discipline, their tendency to reason with the child, or the amount of aggression that they tolerated. There was, however, one area that showed a difference. Parents tended to give their children sex-appropriate toys. But sex-differentiated preferences for toys have been found in infants from 9 months of age. Campbell, Shirley, Haywood, and Crook, 2000. Children play more with sex-appropriate toys even when their parents do not specify. Callie encouraged them to do so. Caldera, Houston, and O'Brien, 1989. It is quite likely that parents are not using toys to turn their children into gender conformists but are responding sympathetically to the child's own preferences. Anyway, if parents' behavior toward their children was guided by their desire to make them conform to traditional gender stereotypes, then we would expect to find that the most sex-typed adults have the most sex-typed children. Yet studies find that there is no relationship between traditional household division of labor, parents' attitudes to sex typing, their sex-typical activities, and their reactions to children's behavior on one hand and children's degree of sex typing on the other. Jacobi, 1998. Following Skinnerian views came social learning theory, which emphasized a hitherto neglected but altogether central primate capacity, imitation. No trial learning. We can acquire a piece of behavior merely by watching it performed by others. But the trick was to co-opt this observation into an explanation of the acquisition of sex differences. This was done by proposing that children selectively imitate their same-sex parent. Laboratory studies were done in which children were exposed to adult models performing a variety of novel behaviors. If social learning theorists were right, then the statistical analysis would show a significant interaction between sex of model and sex of child. Girls would imitate women and boys would imitate men. Dozens of such studies failed to find such an effect. Houston, 1983, Jacobi and Jacqueline, 1974. Undeterred, Perry and Bussey, 1979, devised a cunning experiment which avoided the pitfalls of the previous studies where children had only a one-off exposure to an adult model. THEY showed children a phi-lm of 8 adults selecting a preferred fruit. In The Essential Woman, biophobia and the Study of Sex Differences. 5. One condition: all 4 men made one choice, e.g., orange, while all 4 women made the other, e.g., apple. In another condition, 3 men and 1 woman chose an orange while 3 women and 1 man chose an apple. In another condition, half the men chose oranges and half the women chose apples. THEY found that the extent to which children copied an adult's preference depended upon the proportion of their sex that made that choice. In the phi-RST condition, there was a high degree of same-sex imitation, in the second a much smaller amount, and in the third condition, there was no significant difference between the girls and boys in their choices. This meant that children were not slavishly imitating a same-sex adult but rather judging the appropriateness of a particular, in this case wholly arbitrary, preference on the basis of the proportion of male or female adults who made it. THSA results helped to make sense of previous work which had already shown that children tended to imitate activities that they already knew to be sex-typed, regardless of the sex of the model who was currently engaged in it. Barkley, Ullman, Otto, and Brecht, 1977. What was important was the child's internal working model of gender and behavior. Until then, the differential treatment and selective imitation views had painted a thoroughly passive view of the child. He or she sat, slowly being filled with sex-contingent reinforcement and exposure to adult models. Some developmental psychologists rebelled. THEY knew that children are active participants in their own development. Piaget had shown this. Now Perry and Bussey had put the child's own understanding of gender center stage. It was the genesis of cognitive learning theory. Martin and Halvorson, 1981, argued that children have a natural tendency to think categorically. THEY form categories about all sorts of things from animals to sports, and it would be surprising if they did not, very early in life, form categories of male and female. Once these categories are formed, all incoming information that is gender typical gets shunted into the correct binary slot, and over time a stereotype is built up about what males and females look like, do, and enjoy. It is this internal model or schema, not parental training, which drives the child towards sex-appropriate behavior. It was clear that Perry and Bussey, in their search for the mechanisms of imitation, had laid bare the process of creating gender schema. At the very same time that this proposal was being offered for child development, Bemp, 1981, was proposing an identical schema to explain adult differences in sex typing. She argued that the degree to which we type information as gender relevant is an individual difference variable. Women who strongly sex type information become more stereotypically feminine than women who are less inclined to tag information with gender labels. Cognitive revolution had come to sex differences. It was not a matter of behavioral training, it was a matter of mental categorizing, organizing, and recalling. 6. The Essential Woman, biophobia and the Study of Sex Differences. But the cracks soon began to appear. Children show sex-typed behavior before they are able to label the sex of other children. Rubel and Martin, 1998. Toy choice, play styles, activity levels, and aggression are found as early as 2 years of age. Brooks and Lewis, 1974, Fago, 1991, Friedman, 1974, Howes, 1988, Konstam, 1989, O'Brien and Houston, 1985, Rupnarine, 1986. But children are not able to correctly sort pictures of boys and girls into piles until toward the end of their third year. Weinraub, Clements, Sokloff, Etheridge, and Myers, 1984. Although children can point to pictures of boys and girls when instructed to do so somewhat earlier at about 30 months. Ita, Grinnell, and Ita, 1989, Fago and Leinbach, 1989. For a gender schema to operate spontaneously and successfully, children should be able to categorize without specific verbal cueing to do so. Yet children prefer sex-congruent toys before they are able to say whether the toy is more appropriate for a boy or a girl. Blakemore, LaRue, and Alanik, 1979. THEY prefer to interact with members of their own sex and show sex differences in social behavior before they can label either toys or behaviors as being more common among boys or girls. Serbin, Tonik, and Sternglanz, 1977, Smetana and Letourneau, 1984. Having gender labels at the age of 2 does not predict sex typing either at the same age or 1 year later. Campbell, Shirley, and Candy, 2004. Even where a cross-sectional study finds a behavioral difference between children who can label gender and children who cannot, it is found for only some behaviors not others, or for one sex but not the other. Fago, Leinbach and Hagen, 1986. Children do not need the ability to discriminate the sexes or an understanding of gender stereotypic behavior to show sex differences. Even in later years, as children's gender stereotypes become more crystallized and peak at about 7 years of age, there is no relationship between a child's gender knowledge and how sex stereotypic their own behavior is. Martin, 1994, Paulista, 1995, Serbin, Mahler, Gulko, Paulista, and Colburn, 1994. As Carol Martin, 1993, ruefully concluded after 20 years immersion in the field, seldom are individual differences in behavior and thinking explained by differing levels of gender stereotype knowledge. But perhaps children really recognize gender at a much earlier age than experimenters' artificial requests to point to pictures of boys and girls reveal. Perhaps they lack the verbal or cognitive skills to execute such a task before the age of 3. After all, animals seem to make no mistakes about the sex of their conspecifics, and they lack the sophisticated cognitive machinery that we possess. Researchers turn to infants, using an ingenious method to uncover their ability to categorize the world. Infants, like adults, get bored when they are exposed to the same thing for too long and they turn away, a phenomenon called habituation. Fago and Leinbach, 1993, showed a group of infants, aged between 9 and 12 months, a series of photographs of different men's are. The Essential Woman, biophobia and the study of sex differences. 7. Women's faces. Every now and again, a face of the opposite sex would be shown. Infants would show a sudden recovery of interest when this unexpected face appeared. Has suggested that infants had an implicit category of male and female for, if they did not, how could they detect the category shift when the unusual face appeared? Has seemed to solve the cognitive problem. Infants understand sex much earlier than we thought. But wait, the same type of study has also been performed in the laboratory using different categories such as animal species, rising and falling auditory tones, numbers, colors, and patterns. Bott and Roe v. Collier, 1996, Wagner, Winner, Cicchetti, and Gardner, 1981, Shu and Carey, 1996, Younger and Cohen, 1983. All these studies show that infants can habituate and then recover from habituation. Would we want to conclude, therefore, that 6-month-old infants brought with them to the laboratory an acquired understanding of the difference between a zebra and a kangaroo? Given their limited exposure to such novel stimuli, how could they? Rather, we infer that during their time in the laboratory, infants develop rather than reveal categories for dividing up the perceptual world. So while infants can be experimentally primed to make a male-female distinction, this is not evidence that they have brought it with them from the outside world. Even if they did have it, it would be of no use to them unless they knew to which sex they themselves belonged. Gender schema can only guide behavior when sex of self is incorporated into the schema. Children sort pictures of themselves correctly into the boy or girl pile at about the same time they sort pictures of others, around 36 months. Th. Thompson, 1975, Weinraub et al. 1984. Indeed, they do not seem to even recognize themselves in mirrors until about 20 months. Amsterdam, 1972, Campbell et al. 2004. Th. Is tested by surreptitiously placing a blob of rouge onto the child's nose and allowing them to view themselves in a mirror. If they try to wipe their own nose, they have self-recognition. If they try to wipe the nose of the child in the mirror, they do not. In any case, self-recognition is a necessary but far from sufficient condition for knowing which sex you belong to. Gender schema theory was all too cognitive, and the cognitive data would not fit the developmental time course. And there was the question too obvious to be asked: why do children socialize themselves to behave sex-typically? Is the process one of simple social conformity? If so, is gender a special case, or do children also schematize themselves in other ways? Geeks, athletes, and strive to conform to these categories as much as they do to boy or girl. There lurks beneath cognitive theories a pervasive feeling that there is something special about gender, and that the engine that drives categorization and conformity is an innate propulsion, perhaps not to be aggressive or nurturing, but at least to realize oneself as a male or female. 8. The Essential Woman, biophobia, and the study of sex differences. At the heart of gender schema theory lie stereotypes. Initially crude and concrete: boys like trucks, girls like dolls. They become increasingly abstract and metaphorical with increasing